Hello Horror Hounds. In our journey through the films of Dario Argento, we come at last to Phenomena, the film that fulfills on the teases of many of his previous movies by merging fully the supernatural with the giallo. The film is set in Switzerland, in an area of the country that characters continually refer to inexplicably as the Swiss Transylvania. There is a killer of young girls at large. At the same time, Jennifer Corvino, a young teenage daughter of a famous American film star, arrives at a Swiss boarding school for girls. There, whilst witnessing one of the murders and becoming the target for the murderer, so far so Argento, she discovers her blossoming psychic ability to communicate with insects. That leads her to meet up with Donald Pleasant, who plays a wheelchair-bound entomologist who happens to be nursed by a chimpanzee called Inga. I'm not making any of this up. In previous films, it's fair to say Argento has teased and tested at introducing the supernatural to his giallo murder movies and has introduced familiar giallo elements to his wholly supernatural Suspiria and Inferno movies. Never before has he tried to meld the two so completely, and I have to say right from the top that it's not a successful melding. The film is attacked with such abandon and gusto. It's never not entertaining. And I can promise you that whilst the overall melange is not successful, if you go along with this film, it's one hell of a wild ride. For those familiar with Argento's previous films, the opening promises something that we've never seen before from him. The Swiss mountains setting, azure skies, vivid green grass, crane shots that go up, 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 almost endlessly into the swaying branches of the tall trees, the lost girl, the chalet. All of this screams Hansel and Gretel fairy tale out in the open, natural environment. And then we go straight into a violent, typically Argento movie and the police investigation. Then we're straight back into the fantasy element with Jennifer Corvino, played by a pre-Labyrinth Jennifer Connelly, arriving at the Richard Wagner girls' boarding school in a setup that instantly calls to mind, unavoidably, Suspiria. Later on in the film, the telepathy between insects and specifically Jennifer's telepathic ability to communicate with insects calls to mind the notion of insect psychic abilities first raised in Profondo Rosso, and the cold ice, white, blue lighting visually ties this film to its immediate predecessor, Tenebrae. But on the whole, it's unlike anything that has ever come before from the hand of Dario Argento. The way it's filmed, the way it's shot and lit, like Tenebrae, makes this film feel detached, and where that worked for Tenebrae, potato, potato, I don't think it works so well here with a young female protagonist in an ostensibly fantasy environment. I don't want everything to feel cold and austere and detached. Jennifer Connelly's performance is also cool and reserved. I don't know whether that was by choice, by direction, or whether she found herself mainly surrounded by Italian-speaking actors, and she is very young in this movie, and that might play into it. I'm not really sure, but many of the shots are also from a distance or from a high angle, given the interaction between her and insects. And there are even a few insect POV shots, I kid you not, in this film. A lot of the shots are high up from walls and ceilings, literally fly on the wall shots of conversations going on. So again, from an insect alien point of view, much of this film is viewed, keeping us at arm's length from many of the human characters in the film. It's only really Donald Pleasance as the wheelchair-bound entomologist who befriends Jennifer and nurtures her nascent psychic ability with insects, who imbues the film with any kind of warmth and heart, as you would expect of someone of Donald Pleasance's calibre. It must also be said that heart and warmth comes from his nurse slash helper chimpanzee monkey, Inga, who honestly, the monkey has the most empathetic role in the movie and also has the most emotional character arc. There's no other way to put it. The heart and soul of the movie is Donald Pleasance and a chimpanzee. The fantasy elements do sit uneasily with the extreme gore in the movie. Violence and bloody murder, which is again much more detached than in previous Argento movies, almost perfunctory, a lot less artful. The elements of the lonely foreign girl coming to a foreign boarding school, her sleepwalking, the firefly scene in particular, which is very fairy tale like and fairy folk like, her latent special powers, all lead me to wonder whether Argento's first instinct was to make a fantasy family movie, but was aware that his audience wouldn't accept that, so had to infuse that with what had become accepted standard Dario Argento tropes. I think nowadays, with the propensity of superhero movies and alternate takes on the superhero tropes, like Logan, specifically I'm thinking Unbreakable, I think a straight, honest to goodness fantasy attempt would be much more acceptable, palatable and understood by a modern day audience. Watching it now in the 21st century, it's really hard not to see this as essentially an X-Men origin movie by way of something like Unbreakable. You've got the girl with nascent powers developing, coming to a boarding school, who meets an elderly bald mentor in a wheelchair. It's a weird Swiss-based real-world X-Men movie. The giallo element of phenomena, the killer, who is the identity of the killer, the murders, the violence, merely punctuates phenomena rather than informs it. And this again leads me to believe that the fantasy element, the story of the girl with powers at the boarding school, it is much more interesting to Argento at this stage in his career. But he just can't tell that story straight. People won't accept it. It has to be said, though, that whilst the giallo element acts as punctuation from start through to finish, by the end, the final 20-25 minutes, is pure grand guignol, ultra operatic violence, which is so over the top and bloody, it makes me forgive all the film's shortcomings. Being elliptical so as not to spoil any of the plot for anyone who may not have seen Phenomenon, the body part maggot pit is gloriously icky. There's a character breaking his own thumb to get out of handcuffs that are chaining him to the wall, which further convinces me, as I mentioned in my review for Profondo Rosso, that the original and first Saw movie is much more a love letter to the work of Dario Argento than anything else, especially not a progenitor of torture porn movies. Saw, the first Saw, is a movie looking back, and it's certainly a movie that's tipping a hat and saying thank you to the work of Dario Argento. There's a surprise decapitation at the end of this. There's a showdown on a boat on a lake that reminds me of both the endings of Friday the 13th Part 6 and 7 mashed up. The chimp takes a straight razor to someone, and that makes me wonder if this film in some way inspired Argento's friend and collaborator George Romero into making, a couple of years afterwards, Monkey Shines. If I'm being objective, I just wish the two elements had coalesced better. There are hints that it should have, and it was intended to have. Jennifer and another key character are shown to be the same age, and whenever Jennifer sleepwalks, we see that what she sees is a white corridor with black doors either side of it, and towards the end of the movie, that's shown to be a corridor in the lower level of an asylum where that other character that she's linked to was conceived, shall we say. But that relationship between these two characters, which I think would have really tied out nicely the disparate elements of this movie, is never fully developed. It's just left dangling. Now, many people say that Tenebrae was Argento's last great movie, and that Phenomena shows the first signs of his decline. I wouldn't agree with that for a couple of reasons. One, opera comes after this, and two, to not skip over Phenomena. To know Phenomena is to love it. It's nuts. There's no two ways about it. It's scrappy, it's messy. Another couple of passes at the script to polish it up and tighten all the elements up would have done it no end of good. But in the end, this is a movie where Jennifer Connelly can communicate with insects who come to her aid when need be to fight a black-gloved killer in a Swiss boarding school, where the wind that rolls in off the mountains is said mythically to drive people insane. And in the end, that wind that makes its way in the background and through all the channels on the soundtrack of the movie, this ever-present whooshing, does seem to drive the movie itself insane. I think the sound elements and the buzzing of the insects are possibly some of the most important elements in this movie. There is a kind of mania, a heightened fairy tale madness that runs throughout this movie. And if you're a fan of Dario Argento, you will gladly take his hand and skip madly through those windswept fields with him. I'm happy to go on the journey. Whilst I know that this isn't the greatest movie he's ever made, my God, would I have a world without Phenomena in it? No. Next up is a great movie, Opera.